I've got Thomas Bennett on the phone with a question. And, well, it's more of an observation than a question, because he's very good at political observations. He's a very astute observer of what's going on in the political world.
Really? Well, let's see what he has
And
to
he says, and I've written this down now, he notes that if I take the names Muammar Al-Gaddafi, Osama bin Laden, and Hosni Mubarak, and take the letters and jumble them around to rearrange them, I get itsy-bitsy teeny-weeny yellow polka-dot bikini. Thomas, you're just amazing. Oh, sorry. Welcome to Progressive Soup. My name is David Stevenson. I'll be tonight's host. And with me we have, well, he's been here as Marv Albert.
Marv Albert.
He's been here as Marv Throneberry.
Right.
Tonight we're gonna force him to unmask himself and be Mark Albertson.
There we go.
A very fine historian, written a number of books about different things in the course of American history. Two choices. You want to talk about what's going on in the Middle East and North Africa, or do you want to talk about the anniversary of the 150th anniversary of the Civil War? What suits your fancy tonight?
Well, you could actually do. You can tie it. You can
put them together.
Put them together. I mean, if you go back to that era, developments in Iraq at that time influenced American history in the 19th century.
How so?
Well, the American colonists did defeat the British in the American Revolutionary War, and the British did come back in 1812. But largely at that point, Britain's attention was being diverted from North America. At that point, the crown jewel of the British Empire was India.
Yeah.
The British were always touchy about India, which also included Pakistan. Now that the two have split.
It's always been a pretty substantial country in terms of culture, in terms of natural resources.
Right, and plus they used to sell their goods there too. And but in 1763, the British East Asia Company, which actually ran their effort in India. I mean, that's another topic altogether. How a corporatist entity just ran Britain's colonial agenda, which they did for 100 years in this place.
So would you say perhaps the colonialism? It sounds like I'm hearing that colonialism and corporatism are kind of two variations of the same mindset. You can put the two together at times. I mean, Italy was a corporatist fascist state, and that's what some historians say we're headed for here. But the British moved into Iraq in 1763. I gotta step in here just for a second, because I'll take a little offense at the idea of America becoming a fascist state, because Mussolini, of course, who understood fascism pretty well, is he
one of the original practitioners?
One of the originals.
Correct.
He defined fascism as a marriage between government, corporations, media, and son of a bitch, it makes sense.
Yeah, doesn't it though? All of a sudden.
Well, I guess there goes my criticism out the window, huh?
Yeah. Well, yeah. If you look at what's happening in this country today, sure, you can see the likenesses.
Okay. 1763.
1763, and the reason the British are really concerned is two rivers in Iraq, known as the Tigris and Euphrates rivers.
Now these crescent.
Correct. Now these rivers lead all the way down Iraq to the Persian Gulf, which in turn exits into the Strait of Hormuz, which turns into the Arabian Sea / the Indian Ocean, and you don't have to go far to be to India. Because Pakistan didn't exist at that time, so it's colonial India.
Yeah.
And the British were concerned about the French, which eventually they receded from importance. But it was mainly the Russians and later the Germans toward the end of the 19th century. And that's where you get the phrase from, the Great Game. And that's the phrase I use that phrase myself to to describe what's going on today in Central Asia. But the British were concerned at this point about somebody using that waterway. So in 1763, the British East Asia Company went into Iraq, and they opened up actually a consulate in Basra in 1768.
Yep.
And then in 1798, they sent representatives to Baghdad, and then in 1802 they opened a consulate in Baghdad. So you see, they're going north.
Yeah. Now Basra is the right on the Gulf there.
Correct. It's one
that
of the
was the area that the British during our invasion and occupation of Iraq, that was kind of controlled mostly by the scant British troops that were assisting us.
Yeah, that was their area. Much of their area of deployment was in Basra. Yeah. But of course, the British are no strangers. They were there before.
I guess they had maps, didn't they?
Yeah, but they began to develop this area. They moved in, telegraph, textile mills, that type of thing. But the idea was to prevent the Russians and again the Germans from moving in there, because late in the 18th century, 19th century, I'm sorry, the Germans wanted to build a railroad from Istanbul to Baghdad, and the British were not going to countenance that. And so this is where you begin to get Kuwait being split off, because the British, the Germans wanted to have a steamship line in the Persian Gulf, and the British told the sheikh there, no way are you going to allow the Germans to open up a steamship depot here in Kuwait. And as you get into the 20th century, now oil gets into the picture, so now the strategic agenda has changed. It's not so much to keep the Germans and Russians out of India, as opposed to now you're protecting an energy source. And it's interesting because if you look at that point, you see the British taking their Indian Empire and moving it west into the Middle East. Now fast forward to 2002, 2003, where George Bush is saying, he's calling this area a greater Middle East. So he's taking the Middle East all the way out to Pakistan. Now, as last I knew, you can't move Pakistan and Afghanistan back in the Middle East. It doesn't work this way.
No, they're a bit far removed from there.
Well, what he's doing is that he's banking he was banking on the ignorance of people and their geography to justify throwing Iraq into this effort in Afghanistan in 2001. Because I was reading an interview a piece by General Wesley Clark, who, when he was on Democracy Now! Back in 2007, and he was interviewed by Amy Goodman, and he mentioned that 10 days after 9/11, he was told by a higher-ranking general than himself that they want to knock out Iraq. And he says, well, why? He says, well, that's because that's what we're going to do. So, what does that tell you? When a general comes out and says that.
Yeah. Well, it was no secret, really, because that Iraq was on the radar as the Bush administration opened up for business, because people within the administration have reported that in the very earliest meetings of the different departments of the administration, the different people, that Iraq was laid on the table as something that was needed to be taken care of, that we needed to get rid of Saddam Hussein.
Well, and really getting into that, you see that during the 90s, when they had imposed the no-fly zone, the sanctions had been imposed, those crushing sanctions on Iraq. Of course, Saddam and his followers were eating, and a lot of the people weren't.
Crushing on the middle class and poorer people of Iraq.
Correct. And Clinton bombed the place silly anyway before the invasion in 2003.
Yeah.
But the fact of the matter is, there was pressure building in the world community to alleviate those sanctions. Now, when Bush becomes president, if sanctions are alleviated or eliminated and Saddam is still in power, the country has to be rebuilt. So who's going to get the contracts to rebuild the country? Britain and the United States? I don't think so. It's going to be countries like Brazil, Spain perhaps, Germany, France, Russia, China, Japan. These are the countries that are going to get the contracts. The problem with that for Washington and London is that, especially Washington, the United States has had virtual hegemony in that place since the Second World War.
Yeah.
So now if you have all these other kibitzers coming in, things going your way, suzerainty over a certain area, you rule the roost is what happens.
Okay, yep.
And so if you have all these other kibitzers coming in, and and they're gonna take root, then it's going to be kind of hard for the United States to run things the way they've been able to do so. There's no more Shah anymore. The British had pulled out in '71; they just couldn't afford an empire anymore. So yeah, something had to be done. And if you wait to do something, and there's all these foreign workers there, how are you supposed to bomb the place?
Yeah, because then you've riled a number of nations.
Correct.
Now you've done in fact what the 19 hijackers and the fortunate, which of course were Saudis, did to people from many nations.
Correct.
In the World Trade Center, where there were
Correct.
people that were residents of and citizens of, I think, 100 different nations that were murdered on 9/11.
Right. Well, plus the other thing is, too, in 2000, Saddam took Iraq's oil transactions off the dollar and put them on the euro. And after we, got comfortable in Iraq in 2003, we took Iraq's oil transactions off the euro and put them back on the dollar. Now, I don't think it's a surprise that we're targeting Iran, and Iran has made the same noises. Then there's Gaddafi.
Yeah.
Now, back in 2007 and again in 2009, during these swings through Africa, he made reference to the fact that the African Union is not a viable organization and that perhaps another organization is necessary. One that perhaps Libya could be the seat of power, but also use the Libyan currency, the dinar. So, they don't like to hear that. Washington, London do not want to hear this, because a lot of our currency is not based on gold anymore.
Right.
It's not based on silver anymore, and a lot of our currency, a lot of the value as a international currency is based on oil.
Yeah.
Most of the oil transactions in the world are based on the dollar. So as long as that happens, that accrues a lot of advantages to us. A lot of central banks have to keep dollars in their tills to buy and sell oil. Some of those dollars will find their way back into this country, perhaps maybe to buy this tablecloth or maybe a jacket made here, or whatever the case may be.
Right.
They're also used to finance our debt, via treasury bills, certificates of deposit, treasury notes. So we can keep printing these dollars up and keep running up this debt as long as that situation remains. Now, if it gets to the point where, the countries don't want to back the dollar anymore and alternative sources of energy come along in mass to squeeze oil into the background, that's a problem for the United States. That really is a problem for the United States.
So what could be our saving grace in the fact that we import virtually half of our oil?
Correct.
Could be a problem.
Well, it is a financial problem. Going back to Libya, Libya has twice the oil reserves we do. But there's another thing here too. Libya's bank is a government-run operation. It's not privately run. And he's got 143.8 tons of gold, which is probably worth around over $7 billion now. So he's got enough gold there to finance a fight for quite a while against these rebels.
Now, which countries we mentioned before? You talked about before we came on camera about countries that are not members of the World Bank.
Well, they're not members of international finance. In other words, they do not have privately owned central banks. Their banks are government run. Right. Libya was one. Syria was another. Iraq, I believe, was in that group. I'm not sure about Egypt. Egypt, I'm not sure about. But there were 7 countries: Iraq, Libya, Iran. Syria is one of those countries. And Syria is funny. That's a target. Syria is a target now. So if you can get these people, if you can get into these countries, via these so-called revolutionaries, and get into their banking system, now they're going to be part of this banking system, and they're going to be taken over, by the World Bank and the IMF. So that means, some of these social programs that these tin horn dictators have bought their people off with are not going to be privatized. So that means the free ride's going to be over. Going back to Libya, Muammar Gaddafi financed that great man-made river program where he tapped into the Nubian aquifer, sandstone aquifer, which was in southeast Libya, it was in Chad, it's in Egypt, and it's also in Sudan, I believe it is.
So they can visualize, again, all north central Africa.
Correct.
Which is principally on the surface is principally desert.
But if you can tap into an aquifer like that, I mean, and he's been able, and they've had agriculture in this country because of this, but a lot of fresh water. Now, according to the UN, it's interesting here, of course, this report was in the Middle East, but I'm sure it's not going to be much different with the Sahara Desert in North Africa.
Right.
If in the next 20 years, 25 years, according to the UN, the population in the Middle East right now is like 300 million. It's a rough equivalent of the United States.
Yep.
But they only have 1% of the world's fresh water. They expect that population to double. I mean, 600 million people with only 1% of the world's fresh water. So if you can control the fresh water, that's a lot of political clout.
Well, I've heard often that water is the next. We've been fighting over oil in a number of wars,
correct,
including World War II. But if the next wars will be fought over water.
Well, it seems awful funny to me that one of the most saturated countries in the Middle East is Iraq, with the Tigris and the Euphrates rivers. In the northeast section, where the agriculture is pretty good, rainfall is okay. And there's the groundwater. Of course, the groundwater, I guess the recharge in the recent years hasn't kept up with the pressures put on that area for agriculture.
So they're taking more out than they're putting back.
Correct. But they still have a lot of water. Now, water is instrumental in drilling for oil. You need water for this. But it seems awful funny that all of a sudden now we're making a concerted effort to help oust Gaddafi when they have that fresh water access at the in that Nubian aquifer, and it seems awful funny to me that the timing here is if you put Iraq and Libya together.
That seems odd because this almost has it almost jibes with local issues because we've had Aquarian, a large water company, a large water conglomerate that's back on the buying binge of buying up small water suppliers.
Right.
I don't know for a fact, but it seemed to me that at one time when you own a piece of land, you own what's underneath that land, whatever resources are underneath that land, and what's a sky area above it. You own that also. But now if Aquarian can buy local water companies that are taking water out from aquifers, which travel under your property, my property.
Correct.
Town-owned property.
Water seeks its own level.
Yeah. It seems like they're impinging upon what we own.
Well, I think that's the general idea. They want to control the utilities, water, electricity, that kind of thing. I mean, Wisconsin could be a case, and Michigan could be a case in point, where Governor Scott can sell off, the utilities to people who, his cronies, I guess, for as little as $1.
Yeah.
And what happens then?
No bid contracts.
Correct.
No bids
Correct.
involved.
That means
Scott
eventually,
Walker in Wisconsin.
Right.
Yeah.
And that eventually, does that mean that the people are going to pay higher prices?
I think that's generally the case. I mean, I've seen in Bethel when we've had the north. The water company that's in the northern part of Bethel that always provided the water for Chimney Heights and was purchased. Now the Chimney Heights water fees, and not just Chimney Heights, but the better part of the northern part of Bethel, have all gone up substantially, much more than the amount of money that's been invested in them by the new owners to upgrade the system.
Well, that goes back to what we were talking about before, corporatist fascist state. Where the corporations own, people, the utilities or whatever it is they own, and they raise the prices on it because there's no other
power.
Correct, that's what it is. Now, if you go back to Iraq, to give you a case in point. Now, a lot of the people in Iraq, most of them are Shias anyway. These were just people that floated. A lot of them were nomads. A lot of them floated from place to place. But some people were sedentary, and their families had farmed these particular properties for centuries. Well, it's interesting when the British came there, if they did the same thing there that they did in the federally administered tribal areas in the Northwest Frontier Province in India. Well, it's now Pakistan. But anyway, they appointed selected tribal chiefs and this small growing clique of capitalists, money class, whatever you want to call them, And through these paper deals in the cities, they bought and sold this land. And the people living on this land have no clue. Because
they're not aware that the land that they occupy is being sold out from under them.
Correct. So during the 20s and the 30s, these tribal chiefs, these selected tribal chiefs, owned this land, and now these people were reduced almost to indentured servitude. They had to buy the feed, they had to buy the animals, they had to buy the tools, and if you tried to escape that bondage, because they're in over their heads, they can't get out of this. And if you escape, the word goes out, and you're blackballed, and if you're caught, you're thrown back on the land. So, is that something like that going to happen here? I mean, that's something to think about. Not the same way. I'm not saying it is. But I mean, it's, we're told that we're such a religious country. Well, who runs the banks in this country? Catholics, Protestants, and Jews. Okay, Jewish people. That's who runs the banks. Now, all those religions have restrictions on high interest rates. Usury, they call it. How come then these banks are going to charge you 30-35% on your credit card?
Doesn't seem very very religious.
No, it doesn't. But of course, who cares? They're making a profit. They don't care.
And they can always thrust the blame off on. It's not me. It's the shareholders. We have to satisfy the shareholders.
Right. Well, it used to be in this state too. You can only charge the highest rate that you could charge on a car loan was 15%, and the guy could have had.
I remember those days.
Trashy credit. 15% was tops.
Yeah.
Well, if that's the case, then how come they can charge 30-35% on a credit card in the state? I mean, what's the difference between a car loan and credit card loan?
And likewise, people can see that if they've ever bounced a check, the charge on that is just astronomical.
Oh yeah. So it's do as I say and not as I do. Heard that before.
Yeah.
So, but you're right. Yeah, in fact, there were some American industrialists and financiers who, back after the First World War, went to Italy and went to Germany and saw what was happening. And this is the new world order that's coming upon the world. And then you get the Depression and the Nazis take power in Germany.
Yeah.
It's not. I don't think it's a very good picture, and I think these people that we see, like the Kochs, people like that, want to take us back to the 1880s, 1890s, when you didn't have Social Security, you didn't have aided dependent children, you didn't have Medicare, you didn't have Medicaid.
They certainly had robber barons then, though, didn't they?
Oh, of course.
And for those of you who aren't familiar with robber barons, were wealthy industrialists. Unfettered by government intervention and government oversight, and a fellow by the name of Teddy Roosevelt, as president, did
a Republican.
A lot of good. Yeah, absolutely, did a lot of good. Put a lot of clamps on businesses and a lot of work against monopolies, whether they be horizontal monopolies where one company owns all the oil, or a vertical
like
monopoly where a company owns the oil from the well to the gas station.
And one of the funny things, I always bring this example up when I'm talking to people who say, well, government really hasn't done anything to help the private sector. I said, well, you forgot your Navy. Now, back in the 1880s, when they tried to resurrect the United States Navy, because the United States Navy after the Civil War fell on hard times.
Yeah.
That time they weren't building wooden ships anymore. They're all steel. They're all iron steel. They're steel ships. But our steel industry had fallen on hard times. Sure, they were making soft and medium steel for railroads, that type of thing. But we weren't building hard steel plate for ships, armor plate. And we had to import that technology. Some of that came from Britain. In fact, it was to the point where the largest gun that our foundries could make was a 6-inch gun. Well, as these ships get bigger and more powerful, the 8-inch gun comes into play, the 10-inch gun comes into play, 11s, they go to 13.5s, they go to 15-inch guns on these later battleships.
Powerful enough to pierce another battleship's armor.
Well, that's the general idea. But when we finally got to build these ships, hard steel comes into play. And even Carnegie said later on in the 1890s, close to the 20th century, that if it wasn't for that, you wouldn't have skyscrapers today.
Because you didn't have that higher grade steel.
Correct.
To hold the skyscrapers up.
Correct.
Okay.
So it's interesting how a government program, building a navy is a government program, helped to spawn the skyscraper craze.
Just a transfer of technology from something the government was doing for defense to something to something that
it went to the private sector.
To the private sector, and they got a free ride in a sense because the technology had already been established.
Correct. I mean, it's just like the space program in the 60s when John F. Kennedy said, we're going to the moon by the end of the decade. And we did.
Yeah.
But it spawned other technologies. Now, I remember Jacques Plante, the great goalie, went to NASA and built a light mask for goalies. I mean, the masks were like 3.5 pounds. He built one 10 ounces with these space-age materials. And it was more shock-resistant. So you see how these things carry on here. Well, you need somebody with an idea.
Don't forget about Tang, but by the way, Tang is like
the
worst taste in junk ever.
Yeah, well, you know, when you...
And they probably had to shorten the missions because in a few days they were so sick of that junk that they wanted to come back to Earth and taste something that tasted like real orange.
I remember as a kid they were selling that stuff. I think castor oil was better than Tang.
Yeah, probably was. I've never tasted castor oil, but if castor oil is as bad as Tang, it's nasty stuff.
No, I was given castor oil when I was a kid. I don't miss.
Is it a fish oil?
No, I don't think it's a. I don't know.
Maybe a plant derivative.
Probably, and I think it's one of the most horrible tasting things that God ever put in this earth. That stuff's horrible. Well, I remember Little Rascals too, where they used to feed the kids.
Oh, of course, Spanky and alfalfa,
right,
and buckwheat,
But when I was a little kid in the '60s, I mean, we had it then. And you're going from the '30s to the '60s, but it was being phased out then anyway.
Thankfully.
But you can see how sometimes these government initiatives go into the private sector, and a whole industry is spawned.
Okay, we're getting the 1 minute warning. Excellent. So we're going to just give us one more thought about Libya. What's going on there? Is there a light at the end of the tunnel there?
I don't know if there's a light, but I would ask your viewers
if
there's a tunnel vision. That they watch what happens in the future here. I don't know how far out, but the oil, their central bank with their gold supplies, and the fresh water. The three biggies. That's what I suggest your viewers watch over the coming months and see who controls those.
Not as an investment portfolio, folks. This is watch it in terms of democracy, because a lot of times what happens in other countries can be a harbinger of what we may have to fight off here in America.
That's correct.
So keep an eye on what's going on in the world. And this is Progressive Soup, and I'm David Stevenson, and Mark Albertson, yes!
Yes, not Marv Throneberry.
Not Marv Throneberry. Not Marv Albert.
No, not Marv Albert either, right.
Although you certainly could define Jacques Plante's kick save and a beauty as well as Marv Albert could.
Jacques Plante.
Thank you, Jacques, wherever you are. It's been Progressive Soup. Good night.